This classified document sat in Pentagon vaults for 40 years. When it was finally released, it revealed the most shocking betrayal in American history. Your military wanted you dead. On the morning of March 13, 1962, Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara was preparing for what would become the most disturbing meeting of his career. Across from him sat General Lemnitzer, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, America's highest-ranking military commander. The document Lemnitzer was about to present would reveal that sometimes the greatest threat to a democracy comes not from foreign enemies, but from within. When Lemnitzer placed the thick folder on McNamara's desk, the cover bore a chilling designation: Top Secret, Eyes Only. The code name written across it would become synonymous with government betrayal: Operation Northwoods. "Mr. Secretary," Lemnitzer said without hesitation, "we have a solution for the Cuba problem. We need President Kennedy's approval." As McNamara opened the folder, what he read would shake him to his core. Page after page of detailed plans, diagrams, and operational procedures, all designed for one horrifying purpose: killing American citizens and blaming Cuba to justify war. This was the day America's military establishment officially planned to become the enemy of its own people. To understand Operation Northwoods, we must understand the paranoid atmosphere of 1962. The Bay of Pigs invasion had failed spectacularly just 1 year earlier. Fidel Castro was consolidating power in Cuba, just 90 miles from American shores. The Soviet Union was gaining influence in the Western Hemisphere, and Pentagon officials were desperate for a solution. But desperation had bred something more dangerous than military failure. It had bred a willingness to abandon the very principles American soldiers were sworn to protect. Colonel Edward Lansdale, the psychological warfare expert tasked with developing anti-Castro operations, had assembled a team of intelligence officers who shared a frightening conviction: American citizens were expendable if their death served strategic purposes. Working in secret within the Pentagon, Lansdale's team included CIA operative Timothy Richardson, Air Force Lieutenant Colonel David Morrison, and Navy Commander James Anderson. These men weren't rogue agents. They were respected military officers operating with official sanction at the highest levels of government. Operation Northwoods wasn't a vague concept. It was a detailed 181-page operational plan with specific targets, timelines, and casualty estimates. The plan outlined several coordinated attacks designed to create the appearance of Cuban aggression against American interests. The hijacking deception. The first component involved staging a fake aircraft hijacking. CIA agents would pose as passengers on a flight from Miami to Havana, then report that Cuban operatives had seized control of the aircraft. The plane would actually land at a secret CIA airfield, while the world was told it had been taken to Cuba. But the plan contained a more sinister backup option. If the fake hijacking didn't generate sufficient public outrage, a real passenger aircraft would be destroyed, killing everyone aboard. These deaths would be blamed on Cuban forces, providing the emotional trigger needed to justify military intervention. The Guantanamo Gambit. Even more shocking was the plan to attack America's own military base at Guantanamo Bay. CIA operatives dressed as Cuban soldiers would assault the base, killing American servicemen. The attacks would be presented as unprovoked Cuban aggression, demanding immediate retaliation. The operational details were meticulously planned. A team of CIA operatives would infiltrate Cuban territory near the base, stage realistic firefights with American forces, and ensure that evidence of Cuban involvement was left behind. Terror in Miami. The plan also called for bombing Cuban refugee centers in Miami, targeting innocent civilians who had fled Castro's regime. The irony was deliberate, killing people who had escaped Cuban oppression and then blaming Cuba for their deaths. These attacks would be timed for maximum media impact, ensuring that images of dead Cuban exiles would inflame American public opinion against the Castro government. The ultimate false flag. Perhaps most chilling was the plan to crash a remote-controlled aircraft into a major American airport. The drone, painted in Cuban Air Force colors, would be flown into Miami International Airport during peak hours, maximizing casualties and media coverage. This concept, using aircraft as weapons against civilian targets, was developed 39 years before September 11, 2001. The similarities are impossible to ignore and deeply disturbing. The human cost calculation. What made Operation Northwoods particularly monstrous wasn't just its scope, but its cold calculation of acceptable casualties. Pentagon planners estimated that 200 to 300 Americans would need to die to generate sufficient public support for war with Cuba. These weren't abstract numbers to military statisticians. They were somebody's children, parents, and spouses whose deaths would be choreographed by their own government for strategic advantage. Dr. Harold Wolf, a neurologist who consulted on the psychological impact study, concluded that American public opinion would overwhelmingly support military action if civilians were killed in apparent Cuban attacks. The deaths of innocent Americans were seen not as a tragic cost, but as a strategic asset. When Operation Northwoods was presented to the Joint Chiefs of Staff on March 8, 1962, the response was disturbingly positive. General Curtis LeMay, the Air Force Chief of Staff who had overseen the firebombing of Japan during World War II, immediately endorsed the plan. "This will work," LeMay declared. "This is the only way to get rid of Castro." Admiral George Anderson, Chief of Naval Operations, agreed. "When the American people see that Cubans have killed innocent people, they won't hesitate to demand war." Only General George Decker expressed any reservations, and his concerns were tactical rather than morale. He worried about controlling media coverage, not about the ethics of murdering Americans. The military's enthusiasm for Operation Northwoods revealed something deeply disturbing about Cold War thinking. Senior military leaders had become so focused on defeating communism that they were willing to adopt the tactics of their enemies, including state-sponsored terrorism against their own citizens. Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara, the former Ford Motor Company executive known for his analytical approach to complex problems, found himself confronting a moral equation that couldn't be solved with statistics. "General," McNamara told Lemnitzer, "this plan involves killing American citizens. This is terrorism." Lemnitzer's response was chilling in its matter-of-fact tone. "Mr. Secretary, there are casualties in war. These casualties are necessary to overthrow the Castro regime. We'll save thousands of American soldiers." McNamara pressed further. "What happens if this operation is exposed? The American people's trust in government will be completely shattered." "It won't be exposed," Lemnitzer replied with confidence. "CIA security protocols will prevent leaks. Only a few people will know the truth." But McNamara understood something that the military planners apparently didn't. Operation Northwoods represented a line that, once crossed, would fundamentally alter the relationship between the American government and its people. On March 15, 1962, McNamara brought Operation Northwoods to President Kennedy in an emergency meeting at the White House. Kennedy's reaction was immediate and unequivocal. "This has to be a joke," Kennedy said, his voice rising with anger. "The American military is proposing to launch attacks on its own citizens." Kennedy understood that Operation Northwoods wasn't just morally wrong. It was a fundamental betrayal of everything American democracy represented. If the military could propose killing Americans to achieve strategic objectives, what other lines might they be willing to cross? I reject this plan completely, Kennedy declared, and tell Lemnitzer that such plans should never come to my desk again. But Kennedy's rejection of Operation Northwoods may have sealed his own fate. By refusing to authorize false flag attacks against American citizens, Kennedy had demonstrated that he couldn't be trusted to take the hard decisions that military leaders believed were necessary to win the Cold War. Following Kennedy's rejection, a systematic cover-up began immediately. All copies of Operation Northwoods were collected and secured in the Pentagon's most classified archives. Participants signed new secrecy agreements with severe penalties for disclosure. The plan's existence was erased from official records. Meeting minutes were altered, and budget allocations were reassigned to other projects. The $50 million allocated for Operation Northwoods was quietly transferred to other anti-Castro operations. Key participants were reassigned to different positions far from Washington, effectively silencing them through geographic dispersal and career consequences. The relationship between Kennedy and General Lemnitzer had become impossible. Kennedy refused to extend Lemnitzer's term as chairman of the Joint Chiefs, effectively ending his career at the Pentagon's highest level. On October 1, 1962, Lemnitzer was replaced by General Maxwell Taylor and promoted to NATO Supreme Commander, a prestigious exile that removed him from American military planning. But Lemnitzer's dismissal came with a price. Before leaving, he ensured that Operation Northwoods documents were classified at the highest possible level, making future disclosure nearly impossible. The timing of Lemnitzer's dismissal was significant. Just 2 weeks later, the Cuban Missile Crisis erupted, and Kennedy's preference for careful diplomacy over military action may have prevented nuclear war. For the next 13 years, Operation Northwoods remained one of America's most closely guarded secrets. Only a handful of people knew of its existence: Kennedy, McNamara, Lemnitzer, and the few military officers who had developed it. After Kennedy's assassination in November 1963, even fewer people knew the truth. President Lyndon Johnson was never briefed on Operation Northwoods, and the plan remained buried in classified archives. The few military officers who knew about the plan maintained their silence through a combination of patriotism, fear, and genuine belief that disclosure would damage national security. In the 1970s, Senator Frank Church's committee investigating intelligence abuses came tantalizingly close to uncovering Operation Northwoods. The Church Committee examined CIA assassination plots and domestic surveillance programs, but Operation Northwoods remained hidden. The committee's final report included a vague reference to contingency plans for operations against Cuba that were rejected by President Kennedy. But investigators never pressed for details about these mysterious plans. Staff members later admitted they suspected the Pentagon and CIA were withholding significant information about anti-Cuban operations, but they lacked the authority to compel disclosure of the most sensitive documents. In 1997, Pentagon archivist Dr. Patricia Williams was digitizing old documents when she accidentally discovered Operation Northwoods files that had been misfiled in routine archives. Williams, a historian with a PhD from Georgetown University, was shocked by what she read. Her own government had planned to murder American citizens and blame a foreign country for their deaths. Faced with evidence of planned government terrorism against Americans, Williams made a decision that would define her life. She would risk her career her security clearance, and her freedom to ensure the American people learned the truth. Working alone during evening hours, Williams secretly photographed each page of the Operation Northwoods files. The process took months and required extraordinary care to avoid detection. In 2001, investigative journalist James Bamford published Body of Secrets, revealing Operation Northwoods to the world for the first time. Thanks to Williams's courage, the American people finally learned that their government had once planned to kill them. The revelation sent shockwaves through American society. Major news outlets covered the story with headlines like, "Government planned attacks on its own people." But the public reaction was more complex than simple outrage. Some Americans expressed disbelief that their government could plan such operations. Others saw Operation Northwoods as confirmation of their darkest suspicions about government power. Operation Northwoods has become a permanent fixture in debates about government credibility and the potential for state-sponsored terrorism. The plan's revelation fundamentally changed how many Americans view their government's capacity for deception and violence. After September 11, 2001, conspiracy theorists began citing Operation Northwoods as evidence that the government might have been involved in the terrorist attacks. While these theories lack evidence, the historical precedent of Operation Northwoods makes them impossible to dismiss entirely. The plan has also influenced how Americans view official explanations of major events. When government officials claim that foreign enemies are responsible for attacks on American interests, some citizens inevitably wonder, is this another Operation Northwoods? Despite extensive documentation of Operation Northwoods being released, significant aspects remain classified. Government agencies continue to withhold documents related to the operation, claiming national security concern. This ongoing secrecy fuels continued speculation about whether similar operations have been conducted since 1962. Freedom of Information Act requests for additional Operation Northwoods documents are routinely denied or heavily redacted. Operation Northwoods leaves us with disturbing questions that remain relevant today. How many other false flag operations were planned but never revealed? Did similar planning continue after Kennedy's death? What role did Operation Northwoods play in the broader military-industrial complex's relationship with civilian leadership? Are similar operations being planned today? These aren't paranoid questions. They're the inevitable result of learning that the American military once seriously planned to kill American citizens to justify war. Operation Northwoods teaches us that democracy is not self-preserving. It requires constant vigilance, institutional safeguards, and leaders with the moral courage to reject their own military establishment when necessary. President Kennedy's rejection of Operation Northwoods may have been his greatest service to American democracy. By refusing to authorize false flag attacks against Americans, Kennedy preserved something essential about the relationship between government and citizens. But we cannot rely on having leaders like Kennedy when future Operation Northwoods proposals are presented. We need institutional protections that make such planning impossible, transparency requirements that prevent such secrets from being kept, and accountability mechanisms that ensure officials face consequences for betraying democratic values. Operation Northwoods stands as the most documented evidence that your own government once planned to kill you. The plan was developed by respected military officers, approved by senior commanders, and presented to the highest levels of government as official policy. The only thing that prevented Operation Northwoods from being implemented was the moral courage of President Kennedy and Secretary McNamara. Without their intervention, American citizens would have been murdered by their own government in a false flag operation designed to manipulate public opinion. This isn't ancient history. It's a warning about what can happen when military and intelligence agencies operate without adequate oversight and accountability. Operation Northwoods proves that sometimes your military can become your enemy, and the greatest threat to democracy comes from within. The documents are declassified. The evidence is undeniable. Your government once planned to kill you, and only presidential intervention stopped them. The question now is, what other plans exist that we haven't discovered yet?